This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 891 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. The fantasy football content space is filled with snake draft content. It's filled with the standard 12-team, you pick a guy, then I pick a guy, then our league mate picks a guy, that type of content. And that's because the vast majority of fantasy leagues use snake drafts. As a content creator myself, I'm going to want to make stuff that people want to listen to. I'll definitely dig into more niche topics, but I'm trying to help as many people as I can win at fantasy football. Snake drafts rule fantasy football still. But as we know, a lot of people play in auction drafts too. In those drafts, a team nominates a player to be bid on, like an auction, and league managers bid that player up until no one wants to bid him up anymore. And the highest bid then gets that player. That means that if you don't want a top 10 running back or a top 10 wide receiver on your fantasy team, you don't have to. You don't need one of those players. If you want to get multiple top 5 wide receivers, you can do that if you really want to. There's a little bit more flexibility with auction drafts. That's something that a lot of people enjoy, myself included. Now, I've gotten questions about auction drafts for years. I get them every single summer. And the main one that I get these days is there auction draft information in your draft guide as well? And the answer to that is no, there isn't. At least, not directly. After talking to so many fantasy managers through the years, I think there's a big disconnect happening. People seem to think that auction drafts are just so totally different than snake drafts, that I'd almost need to write an entirely different draft guide that's catered specifically to auction drafts for things to really be worthwhile for their draft. But auction drafts don't have to be as mathematical as you think. People always want auction prices in cheat sheet form. And I get it, truly, I get it. But even more so than what you see in snake drafts and in auction draft, being reactive is your number one priority. Being able to respond to what the draft is doing, your ability to be nimble, that's more important than what my auction prices might say. On today's episode, I'm going to simplify things for you. I'm going to show you why snake draft content can still be beneficial for your auction drafts. I'm going to hopefully give you a process that you can use in your auction drafts that's easy to understand and easy to implement. It's time to stop complicating things so much. Now, before getting into the info, I want to send another reminder to check out Underdog Fantasy. There are best ball drafts going on constantly over there, and you'll often find me in those drafts because I've been drafting hundreds of teams this offseason. But there are tournaments and league types of all sizes. There's probably one out there for you. And I've got a special offer. If you're new to Underdog, go sign up and use promo code LATEROUND. When you make a deposit, you'll not only get a deposit offer on that deposit, but you'll also get a late round draft guide sent to your email for absolutely free. That's a $25 draft guide to your email inbox. So check it out, underdogfantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Make a deposit and you can get that draft guide. So my goal with this episode is to put myself in your shoes. I play in a lot of auction leagues myself. I actually used to write auction content for a while for RotoWorld and their magazines back in the day. I used to really dig into this stuff, and I still do to some degree. So I'm not coming into this without any sort of background on the format. I want to be clear there. Okay, now that that's out of the way, if I'm you, how would I approach an auction draft? Well, the first thing that I would do is take a step back and really evaluate the landscape. Part of the reason me giving you dollar values for an auction draft and why that's not always worthwhile is because those dollar values can change pretty dramatically from one league to the next. Honestly, it's not a whole lot different than rankings. I write about this in the draft guide, but a problem with snake draft rankings and how they completely take over the fantasy football conversation in August, and really any month, is that every league is different. People are so concerned about half PPR leagues and full PPR leagues, and if these rankings are for half PPR or full PPR. But the real thing that you need to be concerned about is how many players at each position you're required to start in your lineup. When it comes to overall rankings, that's going to really change things up. Like, just think about a single quarterback league to a super flex league. In super flex leagues, the price for a quarterback rises dramatically. because teams need them more. The demand increases. Fantasy managers don't think about that enough with running backs and wide receivers when they download a ranking sheet off the internet. How many wide receivers and running backs is your league starting versus how many wide receivers and running backs are these rankings assuming you're starting? When you're required to start more wide receivers, let's say, then those wide receivers become more important. They'll go earlier in your snake draft, and they'll become more expensive in your auction draft. There's also the number of teams in your league that comes into play. And this is more glaring and more obvious in an auction league. But if you're in a 14-team league versus a 10-team one, that 14-team league is going to look worse on paper. Your team in that league is going to look worse because there's a larger gap between picks. You're sharing the player pool among more teams. So each team is going to look weaker on paper. In an auction draft, the more teams in your league, the more expensive each player is going to cost because there are more dollars in the league's economy. In a 10-team league where every team has a $200 auction budget, $2,000 is being spread around. In a 16-team league with that kind of budget, $3,200 are being spread around. That's more money to be spent on players. And that means all of these players are going to be more expensive. And one more thing related to the dollar value of players. Keepers. You guys, when your league has keepers, that's going to change player values because keepers will almost always be cheaper than their market value. So when that's the case, teams then have more money to spend, which will raise the prices for non-keepers. So you of course want to figure all of that out first and foremost. All of my rankings are for 12-team half PPR leagues that start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 flex. And this past week, I did create auction values for my rankings on the Patreon. And I'll be throwing those into the draft guide this week as well. But again, those are for a baseline league that I just talked about. They're not for all leagues. You have to do some adjustments. Like if your league starts fewer wide receivers, let's say, then you should expect those wide receivers to be cheaper than how my rankings have them. And then the question becomes, well, JJ, how much cheaper? And my answer to that is be reactive. Again, I'm trying to give you the tools without having to be super mathematical here. The best fantasy football players in the world aren't just looking at a sheet of paper and drafting off of that sheet. They're reading the board. They're reacting to what they're seeing. If running backs are falling off draft boards faster than my rankings are saying, eventually you've got to react to how things are going in that draft. You at the very least know what my positional rankings are saying, but my overall rankings may be a little off for your league. That's going to happen. And to me, that's not a flaw. That's part of the game of fantasy football. Having to think on the fly to extract value is a huge separator between being okay at drafting and being great at drafting. And the thing that's nice about auction drafts is that it's sometimes easier to be reactive than what you'll see in a snake draft because you're always active. In a snake draft, you have to sometimes wait a really long time from one pick to the next. In an auction, you can get in on the action during every player nomination. And that means the most nimble drafters are going to be at the greatest advantage. With all this in mind, step 1 is, of course, knowing your league. Understand the overall dollars that are going to be spent and understand your lineup requirements. The more you need a position, the more expensive players at that position are going to be. That's no different than what you're going to see in a snake draft. Step 2, in my eyes, would be research the platform that you're drafting on. A lot of you are going to be doing auctions on ESPN or Yahoo. And they have auction prices per player that are going to populate in the draft room. And while I don't have hard data on this because I'm not able to access that data, I would guarantee that many leagues see their player prices hover around the prices that are listed in that room. Because once again, this really isn't any different than a snake draft. It's just that instead of ADP, average draft position, we're looking at dollar values, average cost. Those dollar values are your ADP to work off of. It's your baseline. Now, it's not a bad exercise to take whatever rankings and tier sheet, hopefully mine, that you're going to use for a draft. Take that sheet and mark players where there seem to be huge discrepancies between what the platform is saying and what the rankings are saying. Once again, you should be doing this in snake drafts too. This is all for your prep. I would say to make sure that you have a tiers list because tiers are going to come in handy even more so in an auction draft than a snake one. So if you've only got rankings, just tier those rankings. Group players up that are interchangeable in rank. That becomes important while you're drafting. So you're set. You understand your league, you understand how player prices change, and you've seen some players who seem to be more costly on that platform that you're drafting on versus what your rankings are saying, and vice versa. You're ready for the draft. This is where things start to get way more interesting. All of the snake draft stuff that I talk about in my draft guide or on this podcast, it still largely applies to auction drafts. The biggest difference is that an auction draft doesn't work linearly like a snake draft does. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. In a snake draft, every team is making one pick after the other. It's linear in nature. It's pick 1, then pick 2, then pick 3, then pick 4, and so on. But that's not really how fantasy football is scored or how things go down. Christian McCaffrey, as the 101, is projected to be X number of points better than CeeDee Lamb, who's the 102. And he's projected to be Y number of points better than Tyreek Hill, who's the 103. Or whoever you have in the 1, 2, 3 spots. Those variables won't be equal to one another. Christian McCaffrey's output to CeeDee Lamb's output is not necessarily equal to CeeDee Lamb's output to Tyreek Hill's output. It's not necessarily linear. There are drop-offs that occur, but those drop-offs aren't captured in snake drafts. Like, you ever sit in a snake draft and you're ready to pick a player who's just so obviously the best player available and he gets sniped right before you? And then you have to settle for a player at the top of his tier as opposed to the bottom of his? Because again, we want players at the bottom of their tiers, the last player drafted at that tier in a snake draft, because you're extracting the most value that way. That's the unfortunate side to snake drafts, is that sometimes there are these big drop-offs from one pick to the next. And sometimes it's just pure luck if you're in the right spot or not. That doesn't necessarily happen in auction drafts because you're not forced to make a selection. Every player is priced for who they are as fantasy assets, not because someone is forced to make a selection, which could hypothetically drive a player's price up. Now, does that mean that something like the running back dead zone doesn't exist in auction drafts? Not necessarily. Like I said, all of the ideas that I've talked about and published in the guide or on this podcast, they generally still apply. Like, a dead zone running back who's a player to avoid in snake drafts is generally going to be a player that you don't want to buy into in an auction draft. Because there are reasons from a player analysis standpoint to not draft that player. There's just a chance in an auction draft that it's not as dramatic because no team is forced to pick a player in a certain spot or for a certain cost. So they're not raising the average cost for that player by being forced to pick him. But if you look at a lot of auction rankings, you'll see that the dead zone backs or the stuff that I've talked about with a pocket passer trap, they still hold similar value as they would in a regular snake draft, which means that you can use those same principles from one format to the other. So you understand your league. You've got your rankings and tiers. You're aware that a lot of the same ideas will translate. But how do you know how to allocate your dollars? Here's where the idea of this not being as mathematical really comes into play. Tiers to me are groups of players who are relatively interchangeable in rank, like I said earlier. You're tiering players because we're projecting fantasy football stat lines and football performance, and there's variance to that. You don't have to have insane conviction to say that you like Justin Jefferson more than Jamar Chase. They're both very good players who have incredible ceilings every single time they touch a football field. If you've ever seen a ranking sheet by yours truly, it's an overall ranking sheet that's divided up by tier. So running backs and wide receivers, they can be in the same tier. And then you can sort all of that by position to get positional rankings and tiers. When a player is in the same tier, it means that I largely am cool with getting any one of those players, which means in an auction draft, you should be cool with getting those players for a similar price. As your draft unfolds, the market is setting itself. You should, at the very least, be aware of the prices that players are going for, because then you know that it's generally okay to spend that kind of cash for players in that same tier. But you're really paying attention to two things here. And again, it's no different in a snake draft. On one hand, you're paying attention to what your individual rankings are saying. On the other hand, you're paying attention to what ADP is saying. Let me run through an example. Let's say that you've got Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson in the same tier, And you've also got Amon-Ra St. Brown in that tier. But let's pretend the site that you're drafting on, for whatever reason, has Chase at $55, St. Brown at $55 as well, and then Justin Jefferson at $45. That alone should tell you that Jefferson is probably going to be the better target in your draft. Chase, though, goes for $58 in your auction. Amon-Ra St. Brown goes for $57. You should hypothetically be willing to spend around that kind of dough for Justin Jefferson. But because of where he's listed, you probably won't have to. But the draft itself is setting the market for those players, for that tier of player. And you need to react to it. So anytime a player gets drafted, make sure you're marking that down. Because then you'll have some idea of what you should spend based on your rankings and your evaluation on a player in that same tier. Give or take $1 or $2. Now, since I'm talking about tiers and the importance of tiers in auction drafts, something else that I need to bring up is this concept that I talked about a decade ago for RotoWorld, and that's the U theory. Oftentimes, all fantasy managers will have similar tiers of players. Like there will often be a group of elite quarterbacks, let's say, and everyone knows who those elite quarterbacks are. In auction drafts, you want to do your best to not be the first or last person to draft one of those players from that tier. But mostly, you don't want to be the last person. Now, the reason I say that you don't want to be the first is because you run the risk of overdoing things and setting the market price too high. Have you ever been in a snake draft where someone takes the QB1 in that draft and then no other team follows? And the QB2 doesn't get drafted until like 2 or 3 rounds later? Well, the team who drafted that QB1 completely screwed themselves. They lost a ton of value on that pick. If there's a tier of elite quarterbacks that's 3 or 4 guys deep, then you know that you'll have another chance to get a quarterback from that tier. So again, let's just run through an example so this is clear. There's a tier of 4 quarterbacks at the top: QBA, QBB, QBC, and QBD. Each player is projected to get drafted for $30 or so. QBA goes up, he's nominated, teams start bidding. Chances are that first quarterback in his tier will go around what the market price says in your individual draft. Or if there's no obvious central dollar value, just know you run the risk of overbidding on that guy. If you'd rather play it safe, just bid him up and wait for the next quarterback. Just do your best to not wait until the last player in that obvious tier, because everyone knows there's a drop-off in performance after that player. And that player will often go for more money than the other guys in his tier because people are panicking. Now, it's mostly anecdotal, but check it out during your draft. It's hard to analyze that without anecdotal evidence because I don't have data on the order of nominations, if that makes sense. But it's the U theory because at the start of the U, it's the first guy in that tier. There's some risk in drafting him. He could go for a high price. Then the price is lower before shooting back up at the end of that tier, like a U. Now, with all this rambling, does this mean that I never select a top player in a tier? Or the first player who's nominated in a draft? Look, my tiers are generally not just one player deep, so I'm okay with waiting a little bit in order to extract as much value as possible, in order to see what the market is doing. But it's still okay to go for that first player in a tier if it's clear that his price is lower than it should be. Whether that be because of what your sheets are saying, or what your calculations are saying, or because of what your league's room ADP says. But the idea here is to sort of analyze the market as the draft is going on via your tiers. If you don't have tiers, then you wouldn't know when to really go up or down on a price from one spot in your rankings to the next. Really though, that's not that different than what you see in your snake draft. I talk about this in the guide, but you want to be cognizant of what's going on around you in your snake draft, because you want to extract value there too. It's just a little bit easier to comprehend when you're using dollar values like you do in an auction. Now, in terms of the types of players that you should be drafting, the strategy that you should go with, keep the trend lines in mind. And what I mean by that is, I've had a chart that I've used for years now that shows average draft position versus actual points per game scored. This is how I get the expected fantasy points numbers that I always talk about. Now, I charted every player who's gotten picked in the top 250 of drafts since 2014. I looked at their overall ADP versus how many points they scored. And that creates a scatter plot, which then creates trend lines of expectation. How many points a player will be expected to score at a certain average draft position. And those trend lines are very, very steep at the top before they flatten out. They're steep in the early rounds, which tells you that the guys that you get early in your draft, they're the difference makers. So when I'm doing an auction draft, obviously with league competitiveness in mind, I'm very open to getting more than one first round pick, or players who go in the first round of snake drafts, or maybe 3 guys who go in the first 2 rounds. You don't necessarily have to go full stars and scrubs. But the obvious point that I make in the guide each year is that you've generally got to spend money to make money at wide receiver and running back. The best wide receivers and running backs in fantasy football are generally getting drafted in the early rounds. Don't lose sight of that fact when you're in an auction draft. I would not want to leave that draft without a player who typically gets drafted in the first round and a half of drafts. The hit rates are so much substantially better in that range than the rest of your draft. And then as your draft unfolds, I'll generally focus on just dollar players for my bench. You get the waiver wire. Don't forget that. Your goal in fantasy football is to always maximize your starting lineup's ability. And that's via spending cash on that starting lineup. You don't need to do it all at once either. You can be the bully in your draft room if you pick and choose your battles during an auction draft. And that's a way to extract value as well. But do your best to allocate $1 or $2, usually $1 for your bench spots. When you look at those curves that I just talked about, there's really not a massive difference between a standard 7th round pick compared to like a 9th or a 10th round pick at most positions. And as you get further and further in a draft, those differences mean even less. Like a 15th rounder versus an 18th rounder, that's a 3-round difference. But it's not the same kind of difference as a 1st rounder versus a 4th rounder. There's a much, much greater delta in that latter example. Now, I know that we just went through a lot, and there's even more that we could talk about. But I wanted to give you a blueprint, a way to really think at a high level about your draft so you don't go into this thing thinking it's some alien format. Some format that's not like snake drafts whatsoever. It's a lot like snake drafts. But here are the basic steps to remember as you approach your auction draft. Number 1, know your league and understand how the auction draft economy works. Number 2, tier your players, but also recognize how ADP is sort of tiering players as well. Number 3, then you should react to how your league mates are spending based on those tiers. Number 4, keep the U theory in mind and do your best to avoid drafting the last player who gets nominated from his tier, especially if it's an obvious tier. Number 5, you should be more open to a stars and scrubs approach in most leagues, keyword being most. You would rather have that than a balanced roster that lacks star power. The difference makers in fantasy football really come from the first couple of rounds in snake drafts, and those players are going to be the most expensive ones in your auction draft. And then number 6, the last and final step, don't go overboard with a bench budget. So many of these concepts are really transferable from snake drafts, whether it's how we're using rankings, how we're tiering players and using those tiers, or the types of players who hit and don't hit. All you have to do is, in your mind, convert draft slot to dollar value. And if you want some sort of baseline for that, you're more than welcome to use my new auction values that I created for patrons or for people with a draft guide. That update will come on Friday when the draft guide is updated. But hopefully this long game theory driven episode helps. I know it wasn't that mathematical, but this doesn't have to be mathematical. Some might say it's common sense and they don't need this episode. But I try to address the things that people have asked me in the past. And now anytime someone says, is there auction content in your draft guide? I can say, yes, but you need context for that. And it's episode 891 that's going to provide that context. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel as well. I'm doing draft live streams there, so make sure you're subscribed. You'll get notified when I'm live. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro.